The Rebellers by Jane Roberts. A novel. Read by Martin John. Chapter 9. An hour later, Fitch stood in the rear of a crowded auditorium as Toby spoke to the rebellers. The lights were dimmed. Only one spotlight shone on Toby's mobile features. Over 300 men stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes on Toby's face. Fitch whispered to Sloat, "Where did they all come from? Out of the walls?" Sloat smiled. "You didn't get the whole tour, you know. I was supposed to include the men's quarters. Don't feel cheated, though. I'll show you the rest later. Shush." Toby stood quietly until the room was still. Again Fitch was impressed by his use of dramatic effect. He was superb in front of an audience. Now he turned his head slowly, his gaze encompassing the whole auditorium, so that he seemed to look clearly and knowingly into each man's face. His voice was strong and powerful. At the same time, the meeting had the electric atmosphere of an important, confidential conversation held with only one other person in a small room. He raised his hands, and then, magnetically, his voice rang out. "I've asked you to assemble here for an important announcement. Conditions on the outside are changing swiftly, drastically. I've come to a decision with which I know you will all approve." He had their immediate interest. The men strained to listen. Sloat whispered, "I wish he'd hurry up. He's got something vital on his mind." "However, let me outline our previous position before continuing," Toby said. Sighs rose up from the audience. There were a few hoots. Sloat said, "They know what's coming." He always digresses to keep up the suspense. Fitch looked around, but the men closer to him all wore good-natured expressions of exasperation without any real bitterness at being put off. Toby outlined the rebellers' general policies. Small scufflings were intermixed with quick whispers of anticipation. Fitch himself grew more impatient every minute. Then suddenly the noises ceased. Heads snapped to attention. Toby had said something important, but in such a low voice that everyone grew hushed. Then Fitch made out Toby's import as he continued. "The master plague that we've feared is on its way." At his words the audience sucked in its breath. Toby's voice filled the room. "The bubonic plague, in all its most dreadful aspects, is gathering to do its worst. And why? Because of the stupidity and incompetence. For centuries man has known that filth is a breeder of disease. But when people breed like animals, they live like animals. Indeed, Animals have more dignity. The room was ominously still. All of you have had experience with the plague, Toby said. You've lost parents and loved ones. My heart goes out to those on the outside for whom there is such little hope. Toby's voice suddenly dropped. He spread out his hands and said sharply, However, we must think of long-range goals. It's my contention that if a large body of strong, healthy men do not exist as a pool of hope for the race, then the race has no chance to survive. If 20 million starved neurotics manage to live through the plague, does this mean that humanity survives? He paused, throwing out the question at them and waiting until they formed their own answer. Then he shouted, No, it does not. What is humanity? A physical form only? I say it is more. It is intellect and reason and dignity. It is these qualities that must survive, not the mere number of twisted, sickly bodies. Therefore, I have decided upon this plan in the face of a plague emergency. Again Toby paused. Fitch leaned forward anxiously. Many of the other men did also. Yet a man behind Fitch chuckled appreciatively at Toby's strategy, and Fitch felt a sudden respect for the individual members of the audience. In the presence of an expert speaker, they retained some objectivity. Indeed, a few seemed to anticipate Toby's next remark when he said, We're going to hole in and save ourselves in order to save the race. There were murmurs of both approval and disapproval. His next statement, however, electrified them all. Sloat swore, Damn it! I knew he had something like that in mind. What Toby said was, Let the plague take them. Let it do what no human agency seems able to do. Wipe out the excess population so that man can breathe again. Tumult broke out all over the place. Fitch was shocked himself at Toby's decision. Leaning forward, he caught sight of Gunny Bregan. He hadn't seen the man since parting with him and Sloat the night before. Gunny was one of those who applauded Toby's statement. Toby called for silence. Those who agreed with him quieted almost instantly. The dissenters kept booing. He waited until the room was still again. To those of you who disagree, I have this to say. Getting ourselves infected isn't going to accomplish anything. If we can trust our own scientists, then this plague could be the final straw. The people have no physical or mental defenses at all. But we can help by staying healthy ourselves so that we can be ready when the time comes. They thought that he was finished. A few men in the very back of the room began to move. But Toby had another surprise. One more thing, he said. Head snapped toward him again. Our sense of responsibility does demand that we save those worth saving, those who have something to offer, and those who at least have a chance. When circumstances seem favorable, we'll take certain risks, go into the Ilmar burrow, and bring the artists and writers from the gallery. I have a plan that can be carried out when the time arises. Fitch looked over at Gunny Bargan. Gunny's face was livid. It was obvious that he disapproved strenuously of saving anyone or involving the rebellers in any way. Fitch scowled angrily. All this talk about who was worth saving and who wasn't. He thought of the street cleaners tossing the bodies of the sick and exhausted into the trucks with such jovial and heartless unconcern. Wasn't Toby speaking of doing the same thing in a different way? Was this the world he dreamed of in his days at the gallery? Gunny yelled out objections. "Quiet!" Toby shouted. "It's a compromise. We save some, those who have a chance of surviving. There isn't any need to risk our necks to save the whole Ilmara subdivision. Where do you draw the line? Should we try to save the entire Contropolis of the Northeast, the country? You see how impossible that line of reasoning is? Save a few and be certain of that, and let the rest go." His voice rose in sudden anger. "The masses haven't anything to offer the race, and you all know it. Face the facts. Try to save everyone, and you won't save anyone at all, including yourselves. The masses are the destroyers. The masses, by their indiscriminate breeding habits, have brought all of us to this pass." Even those who agreed with Toby flinched. The lights went dim. The men began to leave, arguing with each other and shouting to get out. Just as Fitch turned, a man pushed a note into Sloat's hand. Sloat read it quickly and said, "We're to meet Toby in his office right away." "We?" Sloat said grimly. "I told you that he'd have plans for you. Let's go see what they are." Toby was waiting at his desk. "Well, let's hear your objections, Sloat, and get them over with," he said as soon as they entered. He smiled genially, but his small eyes were bright and alert. Fitch was instantly on guard, realizing that Toby anticipated opposition and was even now preparing to deal with it. Sloat's deliberate face showed no signs of strain as he began to speak, and Fitch wondered if Sloat sensed Toby's mood as he did. Toby looked like a man ready to spring. The showdown was approaching, Fitch thought. And now he knew which side he was on. The more he saw of life outside the gallery, the more it sickened him. Only now he had a plan of his own. "I agree that it would be an impossible task to try to help the masses of the population," Sloat said. "I wish we could. There's a horrible aspect to just sitting by and letting them die, regardless of circumstances. However, the constant propaganda supplied by the artists is the only weapon the authorities will have to maintain order and to keep the people working. I don't believe that we have the right to take that weapon away from them. And you'd feel impelled to inform those authorities of my plan, wouldn't you, Sloat? Toby spoke softly, but at the same time he leapt forward. I've known of your double affiliation for some time now. It served my purposes in the past, and it's going to serve them now. Sloat's face was white. Toby smiled again and leaned nonchalantly against the desk, obviously enjoying himself. Fitch had to admire Sloat. The chinless face never moved a muscle, even though the game was up. Sloat merely said, "All right, Toby, where do we go from here?" "I'll tell you where," Toby said. "You're going to use your official position to get us into the gallery when the time is right. When the city fathers, if that's what you call them, take off in panic. We're going to load those artists into burro trucks and bring them here." He paused until his words sank in. Then he said with a delighted laugh, "My plan is terrific. We'll use trucks marked with the pox sign. Who'll bother those? Nobody." The whole interview so far had been between Toby and Sloat. Now Fitch realized where he fit in. Seeing the expression on his face, Toby said to him, "That's right, Fitch. You're the one who is going to give us the layout of the gallery and convince the artists to go along peacefully." The door opened. Gunny Brigand came in. Picking up the threads of conversation, he said, "I think we should just raid the galleries and take whatever supplies we need. Why take on more mouths to feed?" Toby ignored him. Gunny glowered at all of them and sat down. "And Sloat," Toby said, "if you're about to protest your ability to get this done smoothly, then we can always capture a few of your friends on the assumption that 3 officials are more effective than 1. What about the possibility of picking up the plague the minute you step outside?" Fitch said. A flicker of surprise showed in Toby's face. Fitch knew he'd been waiting for him to object to the whole plan. But if that were the case, Toby didn't let on. He said, "We'll all be inoculated. Most of us are now. If a new strain develops, of course our chances won't be as good as they are now. By the way, Fitch, this place is closed up as tight as a clam. Don't try anything. No one goes in or out of here until we're ready to attack. I'm not risking anything at all till then." "How long have you known about me?" Sloat said suddenly. "First, I discovered that you were an official of the Burro subdivision. Gunny brought the next little piece of information, that you were also spying for the national government." This time Sloat was visibly shaken. Fitch felt sorry for him. He'd obviously hoped that his affiliation with the government itself was still secret. Behind Toby, Gunny laughed out loud. Fitch glanced over at him with dislike. "That's all for now," Toby said. "I'll see you both later. And Fitch, another thing. Your friend Mandy. I know you've seen him. He's doing fine." Toby smiled ironically, and the wall slid closed. "Come on, my room," Fitch said to Sloat. His brain was whirling. So Toby knew about Mandy, too. Damn him, he thought. As soon as they got out of the hall, Fitch said, "Listen, before I tell you what I have in mind, I need a few answers. And hurry up about it. I doubt that Toby will leave us alone for long." Sloat seemed to have aged 5 years. "What do you want to know?" he said wearily. "Toby seems to think that the authorities won't even try to inoculate the people. Is that true?" Sloat managed a sad smile. "Inoculations? Hardly. The people are scared to death of doctors. They'd rather take their chances with the plague. Doctors mean mercy killing to them. Besides, as soon as food gets scarce, they'll scramble to get what they can, and the devil take the hindmost. To talk of mass inoculations would cause a panic at the least, and some pretty nasty riots." "I can't hardly believe it," Fitch said explosively. "Why the hell don't they begin a crash education program so that the people know what inoculations are? Disassociate doctors from the Mercy program. The artists themselves could plug the program with posters and so forth. You haven't been outside long enough to understand all the complications." "I've been outside long enough to know that no one gives a hoot for anything except their own skins. Those paintings I copied all those years taught me more than I realized. I know how much the people have lost. I have a point of contrast between the way things were once and the way they are now. I tell you one thing. I have a vision from those paintings of the way life can be, and I'm going to fight for it." "You've lost me," Sloat said. "For crying out loud, what do you think you can do? Where do you begin?" He paused, then swung around. His deliberate manner left him. A touch of consternation made his chinless face look sullen and secretive. "Whose side are you on?" he said coldly. "My side. The people's side. I'm sick of you and Toby, both. And all this talk about the poor, ignorant masses. It's a hell of a lot easier to blab about it than to try to change it, isn't it?" "Are you going to work with Toby? If you are, I'm disappointed in you," Sloat said. "You're breaking my heart," Fitch said sarcastically. "As a matter of fact, no. For the present, I'm with you and the officials, but only for now, and only because it suits my purposes. You see, I don't really believe that the officials will abandon the people as Toby seems to think. We're getting out of here, though." we're going to inform your friends and lead an attack on this place. The rebellers are going to help the people whether they want to or not." A soft laugh made both men turn. Sloat had locked the door, but now it flew open. Toby stood there with Gunny beside him. A revolver glinted in Toby's hand. "I have my own key, you know," Toby said pleasantly. "You aren't going anywhere at all. Gunny, close and lock that door. Sloat and Finch and I are going to have a little talk." Gunny locked the door and stood in front of it with a gun in his hand. End chapter 9. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.